Welcome to the Prosperity Podcast.
Whoa. Rick,
hang on.
What's going on? The Prosperity Podcast.
This is unacceptable.
We've been your biggest fans.
We've been defending you.
This is retake 97, Rick. This is outrageous. Right, we're going to have to call it a day. I'm sorry, but the people have spoken. We now have to listen. They've been proven right. We've been wrong. Rick, you're fired.
What, you're getting rid of me? I don't even like property anyway.
Woof. Tell you what, Rob. He's a feisty one, isn't he?
Feel a bit shaken. Not a nice way to start an episode, but you've got to be cruel to be kind sometimes for the greater good of the podcast.
You have. Well, the people have spoken. It's what they all wanted. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's Rick's last show. You've got your way. But anyway, before we dedicate a show to Rick, let's move on with the Property Podcast, episode 19. How are you, Rob?
I'm all right. If we manage to recover sufficiently from that and get our composure back, then we're going to be having a really great episode this week because we're going to be opening up and sharing our own first steps in property. Because a couple of weeks ago, we talked about our goals, and we're focusing on ourselves again today by talking you through the first properties we ever bought. And if you stick around through the self-indulgence, we've got another really great book recommendation as our resource of the week.
We have to point out the self-indulgence has been requested. We've had more than one listener who's got in touch. A few people now have actually said, guys, the information is fantastic, but can you give us a tangible example of how it could work? And it's going to be interesting because your first investment will never be your best. You're probably going to see that from what we're going to go through. However, there's lessons you can learn. So hopefully from our mistakes and what we've got right, you can learn a lot from this episode. So I'm really excited about it. But it's been quite a busy week gone and week upcoming. Myself, I've been to a wedding. We've had a surge of appointments. I don't know if it's summer and people have got time off now and they're just booking in to come into the office and visit our MP and put their plans together. Also, we've got a big interview each later today, Rob, haven't we, to record?
Yeah, with Mr. John Demas from Entrepreneur on Fire. This is another of those really brilliant things that have come about somehow as a result of doing this podcast. It's another podcast. We've linked to it before. I'll link to it again in the show notes that we're just huge fans of and we listen to it every week. It's a daily podcast, so we listen to it most days, actually. And we're going to get to be featured on it. So that is a really exciting moment and it's all come about because of this podcast.
We're really honoured to be on the podcast because it's one of the biggest in the world. Over 250,000 people download it every month. It's absolutely huge. It's a podcast well worth listening to because there's some really fantastic people been interviewed on there and somehow we've managed to squeeze ourselves in too.
Yeah, bonus.
And also, if that wasn't good enough, the fantastic Rightmove have featured us.
All thanks to @RightMoveAddict on Twitter. That's Andrea Morgan. She got in touch. We've had a lot of back and forth and she's ended up interviewing us for the Rightmove blog. It tells the story of how this podcast came to be and a little bit more about us. And it's really great to be there on the blog of a resource that we use so often. So thank you very much to Andrea for that.
It's the biggest property website there is in the UK. So to be interviewed on there was a real honour. So it's been awesome. The support you've given us has only allowed us to do these things. So thank you for continuing to listen in your thousands. We do appreciate it. We love doing this and we're happy to carry on because the support is fantastic. That leads me in nicely to say, please do keep your reviews coming because these things are coming about because of the reviews you've left and people have taken notice. So please continue to leave your 5-star reviews because that should keep people finding us. It will allow us to do these exciting things. So thank you very much. As we do always, I'd like to thank two people in particular this week. Both of them called Chris, so it's a nice easy one for me. The first, Chris says, he found this podcast by accident. Very helpful and refreshing content. The format is simple, punchy and friendly. The American voice is naff. Don't worry. We've sorted that one, Chris. Regional accents would be better. Stay tuned, Chris, because you'll see what's going to happen next week. But that's my only moan, he says. It's fantastic, helpful, thought-provoking, a great help to me, a self-made landlord property developer who's making it his way by watching others' mistakes and learning a lot. And also a bit of luck. So thank you, Chris. That's a really nice review. And Chris B, 2013, says, a great podcast that's full of really useful information and good advice. It's really great that they take the time out to do these podcasts, which I know many people find interesting and ultimately a great source of inspiration and using everyday language. It highlights the pitfalls and best practices, which ultimately benefit the landlords and tenants. Thank you, guys. Well, super. Thank you, Chris and Chris. Lovely reviews, and it proves that we also listen to them as well.
And yeah, it makes us feel really great to read those and really spurs us on. We've taken episode ideas directly from the iTunes reviews in the past. So if you do have anything that you want us to cover in the future, like we're going to today, then let us know in the iTunes review or let us know by contacting us through the website. But for now, Rob, shall we get moving on to the news?
Yes. In the Express this week, there was an article put together, and it was an agent, and he was explaining why he thinks the property London price bubble is going to continue. He talks of Cyprus money now coming into the country, so where we've had a lot of Russian money and Chinese money and money from Singapore, people all coming into London and buying. Now Cyprus, that's happening too, because since the crisis over there, lots of people are bringing their money back into London because they see it as a safe haven. And he uses an argument to say that this will continue and the property price bubble in London will move forward and onwards. Interesting, Rob. I'm not so sure. I know it sounds weird for me to be negative because every time there's a price bubble, people always say, oh, it's different this time. The prices will continue. And that's a typical telltale sign of a bubble when people say, oh, this time it's different. What do you think?
It was interesting, actually, that it talked about this whole Cyprus thing being underreported. It said in the article that you don't hear that much about it relative to the impact that it is having on like wealthy Russian investors and stuff wanting to move their money around. And I thought that was just me being out of the loop because I was abroad, but it seems like that has really been underreported. And yet another driver of that ripple effect that you talked about a few weeks back, having just all this money plonked into the middle of London, is like having ripples going out sort of way into the rest of the southeast and beyond. It's just another interesting reminder of that, but whether it will continue, I just don't know. I don't see there being a massive crash in London, but I do feel like at some point we're starting to hear lots of good news stories about Help to Buy and prices and activity and so forth in the rest of the country. And it feels to me like London might start slowing down or maybe kind of coming to a little bit of a standstill and the rest of the country might catch up, which in my mind is no bad thing because London has just been romping away from the rest of the country to a ridiculous extent in the last few years.
It's really interesting, Rob, because we didn't talk about this article before we've started recording, and my views are almost identical. I do think the value now is outside of London. I don't think London will crash. I just think it's going to slow down. Now, I can't say when because nobody knows. It could push on strong for another 2 years before it starts to slow down. But I feel there's so much value now outside of London, you know, these commuter towns that you can get to London within an hour, that in London you might get a one-bed apartment for 300,000, or you can go and get a detached house, 40 minutes away from London. Some people will still want to live in London, but a lot of people are going to say, well, actually, I see the value. I'm happy to commute. I want to live outside of London. And I really do feel that's what's going to happen.
You buy for different reasons, don't you? Like all these foreign investors are buying because London's safe, and London will always be safe, even if you're not getting a great yield. If you've got a decent property in London, you're not going to struggle to rent it out. I suppose it's like the equivalent of buying a share in a really massive company like Tesco or something like that. Like you're not going to get the highest yield, but it's not going to collapse. You're pretty safe. Whereas the value, the things that maybe other people haven't noticed and the things where there's the most growth potential are going to be outside London. Like I was reading in The Economist this week about York, which I didn't even realize is only like 2 hours by train from London. And apparently that's really booming with lots of new jobs and lots of tech initiatives. And so you can see there's so much more potential for growth there if prices have been held back by regional trends. Whereas London, it's going to hit the ceiling at some point, isn't it?
There's something I said a few weeks ago on a podcast that I really believe rings true here, that when people start talking about an area being the ultimate hotspot, the place to get your money in, you've already missed the boat. And I think because everybody's banging on about London, the best side of the growth is probably past now. The best time was probably 2008. If you got in then, you would have seen a tremendous amount of growth. I think we're both in agreement that it's probably going to slow down at some point in the near future, whether that's 6 months, a year, 2 years, and the rest of the UK will play catch up. But let's see, we're on record now. We put it out there. Let's see what actually transpires. But talking of investments, Rob, that's what we're looking at this week, our own.
We are. That leads really nicely onto our topic of the week, which is our very first property investments. We're each going to share our first couple of purchases. And like you said in the intro, it's not just self-obsession. We do get asked about this a lot. And the idea with this episode is we're going to talk about what we did. We're going to talk about why we made the investments we did and how we feel about them looking back now. And hopefully if you're in a position of just getting started, you'll hopefully be able to relate to some of the things that we were thinking about. And from listening to our stories, you'll realize that you don't have to absolutely nail it with amazing deals right out of the gate. If you have been investing for a long time and you're more experienced, then maybe it'll prompt you to think back to your first deals and how you feel about them in retrospect now as well. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone as a result of us sharing our stories. Rob, do you want to go first and talk about your very first investment?
Sure. My first and second investment actually came very close together, but they were very different. The first investment was a property I used to live in. I'm originally from Liverpool, but I've spent the majority of my life living on a place called the Wirral. And the property I bought there when I chose to live in it was a very large 2-bed apartment, over 800 square foot, very close to the shoreline, the River Mersey, so good area, nice place to live. But I was thinking emotionally. I wasn't thinking best yield, best tenant demand, and so on. I was thinking this is a nice place to live because I was buying with my heart, not my calculator. That's the first thing I should say. At the time, it was when you can buy with very little money down. It was in the crazy days pre-credit crunch. I bought with a 95% mortgage, and the property was just over 100,000. I moved out after the credit crunch, so I bought just prior to it and moved out just after, and I notified the bank that I was changing the property to a buy-to-let mortgage. So you have to ask their permission, but at that time they seemed pretty happy to do it. I think one of the big things was the credit crunch is so scary that they were just like, well, yeah, as long as you're going to pay the bill somehow, we don't mind. So they were pretty open to change. The good thing that happened on that property is that the mortgage changed eventually to a standard variable rate. Now, standard variable rate, for those people who don't know, is you often get a mortgage and it's on maybe a deal for a couple of years or 5 years. You often fix in a discounted tracker, or you actually fix the rate. We've got an episode on mortgages coming out in the near future, so I'm going to too much detail now. But what happens after that rate is it moves to standard variable. The standard variable rate was better than the discounted rate I got when I bought the property. So the mortgage now is roughly 240. So I've rounded these numbers slightly just to make the examples easy. And the rent is 475. And when I moved out, which is nearly 5 years ago now, that property was rented. The same tenant who moved in is in there now. Dream tenant. And I have to say, if you've not invested in property, that doesn't always happen, So I don't want to give you the wrong impression that you're going to have tenants that live with you for, half a decade every time, It's been great, very little problems. And actually, because the property itself was relatively new when I bought it, it wasn't a new build, but it was only a few years old. It's not had any issues. I've had the washer dryer need repairing once or twice, but other than that, it's been pretty straightforward for me. The management charges on that are quite low as well, so that was an interesting one. But then I moved out. After moving out, within a few months, I went on to get my first, I suppose what you could call real buy-to-let, because it was intentionally bought. And as I was working in the industry, property prices had come down. Credit crunch had just finished, about late 08, early 09. I targeted Leeds. So Leeds is a city I know well. So the research side of it was easy for me because I lived there for a few years. So I knew Leeds. And for those of you who know Leeds, it's near Clarence Dock. If you don't know, you can just quickly Google it. It's in the city centre. It's a walk to the city centre. Because I worked in the industry, I managed to buy below market value. So at the time, the property value was around about somewhere between 110 and 120. I probably would say 120, but I just want to be conservative for this example. I got the property for 87,000 because there was a lot of them reserved and the developer needed to move them on because it was a scary time in the market back then. If you think back, I know things have settled now and property prices are moving, but back then you had to be very brave to invest. I'll give you the rent now because it's gone up since I bought it. The rent now is 700. The mortgage on that is around 203. It was bought on a 70% loan to value, that one, so it was 87,000 purchase price. Because it was a new build, it was 70% mortgage, because most new builds mortgages at that time, you could only get 70%. I know you can get a little bit higher these days, but at the time it was 70%. As I say, not a great time, you had to be a bit brave, but I could see the value there. And then service charges and ground rent come in about £90 per month. So all in all, I'm up about £300 a month profit on that every single month. So that's a really good, strong investment. And it's one of the better ones I've ever done, actually, considering it was the second one I did. The first one, you would not go out and buy on those figures now, buy for 100 with a rent of 475 because you should be trying to achieve a lot better than that. The second one bought for 87 with now a rent of 700. So you can see the difference, and it's vast difference. And I was looking this morning, Rob, on Rightmove before we came on air, and there's properties in the same block, and there's only a couple on the market, and the 2-beds in the same block are now starting at 140. That's an asking price, so it might not get 140, but there's nothing been sold in the block for the last couple of years, which is interesting. So I didn't have anything on the land registry. So I just looked to see if there's anything been listed recently, and there was. That's investment 1 and 2. Very different. One, you could say, was quite a boring, nothing exciting deal, and not, the numbers aren't that great. The second one, you could say, is a bit of a wow deal. It's like, woof, that's some really good numbers there.
Well, we're going to come to a summary at the end when I've talked about mine, but if I could just ask you a couple of questions while I think about them about those. The first investment, it was interesting saying that you kind of bought it with your heart because it was somewhere that you were living, and that's going to be similar to mine, as you'll see in a minute. But I thought maybe that could be the reason why you've had the same tenant in there for a long time and you've got really strong rental demand, because you bought it because it was a nice place to live. And if you thought that, then chances are lots of other people are going to think that's a nice place to live as well. So that might not actually be a bad test to use when buying anywhere. Because it's like, well, is it just that the numbers look good, or would I actually want to live here? And it seems like that thinking about that has accidentally stood you in quite good stead, even though the numbers aren't spectacular at the moment.
It clearly is a factor because, it's a nice leafy street. As I say, it's a short walk to the waterfront. You can get there within a minute's walk. So it is a nice place to live, and it's a big apartment, so I could see why the tenant has wanted to stay there. And at $475 a month, it's probably no surprise. Could I get a little bit more on the rent? Probably. But again, it's that opportunity cost. If I move him on and then it takes me 3 or 4 months to find a tenant for an extra £25 a month, say, it's not really worth my while because I've taken a knock on 3, 4, 7, 5s during that time. The rent has actually moved up since he first moved in. You just got to be careful on that. I think we're not robots, okay? So you're never going to only be able to buy with your calculator. There's always going to be some emotion involved. The Leeds has had 2 or 3 tenants in the same time. But that's not excessive, and it's always rented really quickly. That doesn't worry me too much because if you've bought in a good area with good solid fundamentals, which you should be doing as a standard procedure, then you should always get tenants even if they move on. It should never take too long. So yes, I definitely agree with your point. Would I invest in that particular one now? No. But do I regret it? Absolutely not. No, it got me started.
Then Leeds has still got those fundamentals. It's not a city that I know very well, but I know that there was an oversupply problem at one point and values did kind of fall in the crunch and they're sort of rebounding now. But what kind of research did you do before buying? Did you go from knowing nothing about Leeds to doing a very deliberate campaign of research about buying that particular investment? Or was it an area that you were aware of beforehand?
The answer is I did know the area. I hadn't lived in that particular part of Leeds, but I was familiar with the area. I knew it was walking distance into the city centre. And I remember, because I lived in Leeds pre-credit crunch, so a few years earlier, and I remembered the cheapest apartments. I knew they were flying up everywhere, but the cheapest ones you could get into were sort of 150, and they were awful. So I remember the prices, a half-decent 2-bed was way over 200,000. After the credit crunch, it just seemed like there's so much value in it because to be able to pick a 2-bed up in a really nice block for 87, it just screamed value because that effectively meant that they were 50% or less than where they were. And I just felt that, as often happens with any boom or bust, the boom accelerates too far, but the bust comes too far down the other way as well. So it overshoots both ways. And I felt that the amount of rent return for that particular apartment, where it was and what they were selling for only a year or so earlier, it just screamed value to me, numbers-wise. If I'd listened to, a vast group of people, I would never have bought that because that would have been emotion. But the numbers, it just said to me, this is just strong. That they can't stay this low forever. The fundamentals were there, the rents were strong, and even if the prices rose on the back of the rents, which you could argue that's the only reason why they've gone up, it was still going to move forward in pricing. So yeah, I was really happy with that one.
And you've got a hell of a yield on it, which is a bit of a preview about what we're going to be talking about next time. All right, well, shall I talk about mine then?
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing your story, Rob, because I know where you've bought, but I don't know the ins and outs. So it'd be quite interesting to hear what you've done.
The first one, I started out buying it as my own home as well, exactly the same as you. And it was a one-bedroom flat in King's Cross that I bought in 2006. Back in 2006, it's kind of hard to imagine now, but the market was ridiculous. It was like the peak of the mania, and I was trying to buy my first place, and everything, like you had to view things the second they came onto the market or they'd be gone. Like you'd have people calling up and cancelling viewings because someone would have snapped it up without even seeing it. And you'd have things which are going to like sealed bids, and it was just nuts. I was trying to buy somewhere in the middle of all this, and at the time I was working full-time. I was often working very late into the evening, so I was looking at King's Cross because it was really well connected for trains and night buses from any part of London. So that was kind of the criteria that I was looking at just for somewhere to live. And in King's Cross, I found this ex-local authority property, which no one seemed interested in, even though the rest of London was going nuts. No one was viewing this place, even though it was in an amazing location. The rooms are huge, and it was really cheap comparatively. I think the reason for this, for the lack of interest, was that it was right on the edge of an estate that about 5 years previously had been really notorious. Like you'd Google the name of this place and the craziest like newspaper articles would come up about all the stuff that had been going on there. I think that really put people off. But if you actually went there, you could see that it had been totally cleaned up. They put a lot of money into it. It was just a totally different place. So it didn't bother me because I knew that they'd sorted it out and I was just buying somewhere to live and I knew that I'd be happy there. But I did still consider the resale part of the equation. Like I knew if I wanted to sell it on, it would be something of a problem because like an ex-local authority on the edge of an estate, it's not going to have the same appeal of a 3-minute walk away. There are all these beautiful Georgian terraces. It's never going to have that kind of appeal. So I knew that would be an issue when it came to reselling, but I was okay with that. In the end, I bought it for 177,000 and I don't remember what the asking price was, and I didn't negotiate very cleverly. I knew nothing about negotiation at all. As I said, there was like zero competition, so I got something off the asking price, definitely. And I lived there really happily. And then 5 years later, I wanted to move out. So I got consent to let from my lender and I rented it out to a couple of students from UCL. And that's still rented out to students now. And it's generating a rent of over £1,300 a month. And if I wanted to, I could put that rent up. And when these tenants leave, I've got brilliant tenants at the moment. When they leave, I might put the rent up. And by pure fluke, King's Cross as an area as a whole has had a lot of investment over the last 5 years. So it's worth substantially more than I paid for it now. And so there's equity that I can tap if I want to. And I can't imagine ever wanting to sell it. I'm hoping the reason I can't imagine selling it is because it's such a brilliant rental unit. I don't know. It could be that there's some emotional attachment tied up in there as well with it being my first home. But that's one where I definitely bought it for me and then got very lucky that it's turned out to be a good investment property as well.
So before I ask you some questions on that, let's hear about your second one, see if it's a similar story again to what I did.
Well, this is where we diverge, I think. This is my first intentional investment, and this is 18 months later or so. And by this point, I'd been doing a lot of reading online and going through forums. Like back then, there was a forum called Singing Pig, which is really popular. And I was thinking a lot about different investment strategies. By now, I was actually running my own business and was trying to scale that. And I had really limited time. I knew I wanted to buy somewhere. I was really interested in property, but my main concern was buying a rock solid, reliable income stream. I just wanted to buy somewhere and not think about it ever again. I just didn't have the time, but I just wanted to be in property because I knew that it was such a great long-term form of generating wealth. That kind of got me into the idea of buying specifically to let to a housing association. And the idea with that is that they'll guarantee the payment of the rent for 3 or 5 years. So they're renting it on to people who are receiving housing benefit, but they're taking care of everything. They'll take care of all the management, and whether they get paid by the tenant or not, whatever happens, they will pay you the rent guaranteed on the first of the month for either 3 or 5 years. And supposedly they'll return it to you in the same state that you gave it to them, although I haven't put that to the test yet. I did a load of reading about this. I got some advice from a couple of people. I spoke to the Housing Association to find out what there was a demand for. And I specifically bought a 2-bed ex-local authority flat in Tottenham to rent to them. I know a lot of people don't like flats, but I like flats. There's less maintenance. I like ex-local authority flats because they're big and they tend to be cheaper, and the service charge is sometimes a bit more predictable than with a private company. So I bought this flat for 135,000, two-bedroom flat, and it was a probate case. But for some reason, the sons who were selling it had just put in a new kitchen and carpet, so I didn't really have to do anything to it at all. That now rents for £754 through the Housing Association. My mortgage is £320. My service charge is about £100. It's quite a lot a month. And so it's making me a profit of about £350 a month. And I could have done better with that, but at the time, I valued consistency of income and lack of effort above everything else. So it made sense for my circumstances back then. Now, I'm at the point where my contract with the Housing Association is ending soon. So I've got to decide whether to let it to them again or take it back. I'll probably actually take it back because I know that if I rent it privately, I've got the potential to make about another £300 on the rent, and I've got more capacity to deal with anything that comes up. And obviously, I'll have the risk of voids and I'll have to have agents' fees coming out of the extra £300, but it will end up more profitable. I bought it for a very specific purpose. That purpose isn't so relevant for me now, but I think I can still make it work for me in a different way. That's my first and second investments.
I know King's Cross really, really well, so I know what you mean by that boom. It has gone crazy. RMP Property did their meetings out of that area, so I know I've seen it myself since I've been in London. Did you know that was going to happen?
No clue. The thing about King's Cross is it kind of had the fundamentals. It's so well located that something had to be done with it. And they were moving Eurostar at the time. It used to run out of Waterloo and then they moved it to King's Cross. And as part of that, there was a whole redevelopment of St Pancras. And it's like, well, you're not going to want all these French tourists and business people stumbling out into King's Cross and into all the prostitutes and the boarded up buildings and everything else. So it was obvious that something was going to happen at some point, but I didn't care. I bought there because it was convenient for me and got very, very fluky with everything that's happened afterwards.
On a complete side note, if you're not from London, don't visit the St Pancras station. It's one of my favourite buildings. It's beautiful. Back to business, though. That's really interesting because, as we were talking about before, when it's common sense, a lot of people seem to overlook common sense principles. So we were both saying, just outside London now, it just seems common sense that the property prices will move because there's just such a vast difference in value. And it seems you applied the same principle to King's Cross because it is Zone 1. Its transport links are fantastic. It's really central. So why is it cheaper than everywhere else? It doesn't make sense. It's almost like it was so obvious that people overlook it, and it's only people follow herds, and that's why people who will now come into the market late into London and start piling into London when maybe they could have looked just outside of. And I'm not saying they're making a mistake there. It's just that sometimes the simplest things are the easiest to miss.
I consider myself lucky that I had my own reasons for buying there because I couldn't have trusted myself if I'd spotted that to have the confidence to go for it just as a pure investment.
I've already answered this on my first investment, but would you have done your first investment again? And I think this might be a different answer. If that was going to be a buy-to-let and looking back at what's happened, would you have said, yes, I'd absolutely do that deal again? Or no, I wouldn't?
Yes, I absolutely would, but I don't know if I would have done, if that makes sense. So with hindsight, it was a really great idea. But if I'd been in a different situation, I don't know if I would have had the confidence to do that. Because the interesting thing about both of those places that I've talked about is that I bought both of them when I was totally alone in the market. The King's Cross was when all this madness was going around and this place was just ignored. I was the only one who showed up to see it. And when I was buying in Tottenham, that was when the credit crunch had hit and no one was buying anything. And again, it was in another very unfashionable area. So that's a kind of a scary place to be. It's potentially a rewarding place to be, but you kind of know that you're either ahead of the game or spotting something that no one else is, or you're just being really stupid. It's going to be one of the two. And that was the case for both of mine. And so I think I was lucky to have it forced on me because you got to be a little bit brave.
My answer's different on the first one. I don't regret it at all because it got me started. But would I now go out and pay that money for that type of investment with that type of return? No way. But do I regret it? Absolutely not, because it makes me a profit every single month. The tenants live there from day dot, and it's like I don't even own it anymore because it runs so easily. Similar to your second investment, any regrets or do things differently? I know you've sort of touched on it already, but how would you do it?
It made sense for me at the time. I don't know if I'd do it again now, because I wouldn't be specifically looking for something that was so predictable. I mean, at the time I was very risk averse. And now I wouldn't be so scared of the potential of voids or anything else. And I wouldn't mind if I need to sort things out. I've got more time on my hands and more flexibility. If I were doing it again, I wouldn't do that. I'd be able to get a higher return for my money in another type of investment. And I think I'd probably negotiate harder as well. Like, looking back, it was such an absolute dead time for the market. And like I said, it was a probate case. They needed to do something with it. I probably could have driven a much harder bargain. And so that's a regret. I certainly didn't overpay, but I think I could have taken advantage of being like one of the very few people looking to buy property at that time and really got a good deal on somewhere. We'll come to this in the summary in a moment, but I think that's just knowledge. At the time, I didn't know the power that I had, and now I do, so I do things differently.
Let's generally summarize over both of what we've learned. I think we've gone personal today. We've given you an insight into our beginnings as property investors, and maybe we'll do an episode in the future where what we've gone on to do since, because we've actually gone into investing in different areas and done different things from how we started. So I think that'll be an interesting episode. But looking at our very beginnings in property investment, I think have no regrets. Your first investment will never be the best deal you do. It'll probably be one of the worst, unless you're Rob and you're buying King's Cross. You will learn a lot. We've said this before, but you can read the books, listen to the podcasts, but when you take action and do it for real, you're going to learn. You're going to learn more than any of this. It's the best education you can have. So as long as you're cash flowed well, don't worry about it not being perfect. Just get going. Is there anything else, Rob, you'd add?
I completely agree. I think your second investment was absolutely blinding. Mine wasn't as good. I think over the two, we both could have done better, but it just doesn't matter at all. I don't care, because we got started, and that's the important thing. Going a few years into the future, you can see that the money that both of those have made for us since, we wouldn't have had that if we hadn't started. And you just learn so much by doing. I'm hoping that hearing our stories will kind of be really helpful for these people who I've heard from a few people recently who said they've got real analysis paralysis. They've been doing all this reading and they just don't know what to do, and they're really fixated on getting the absolute best deal. It's like, just don't worry about it too much. The first one won't be incredible, but you'll start, and starting is the most important thing.
So which leads us nicely into the resource of the week, Rob, because that's also a story of someone's journey. Barbara Corcoran, there's a TV program in America called Shark Tales, which is very similar to Dragon's Den. So it's where entrepreneurs go in, pitch their business ideas and try and get investments. She's one of the sharks. I was going to say Dragon's Den. She's one of the sharks on the show. She used to run a real estate company over in America, an estate agent, which would be over here. And she started with very little money, $1,000, and turned it into a multi-million-pound business. Really interesting book. There are lessons you can learn about property investment within the book, but I think it's just very interesting to learn about property in general. And I know it's the American market, but again, there's things you can take away from it. There's talk of when there was booms and when there was busts. You'll really enjoy the story. It's quick, it's easy to read. So that's Shark Tales by Barbara Corcoran. You can find it in the show notes if you go to the website for this episode, which should be the Property Podcast /19. Go and have a look. Buy the book if you think it might be of interest, but I certainly enjoyed it. And Rob, I can certainly recommend you picking up a copy too.
Yeah, it's on my Amazon wish list right now. I haven't read it, but I have heard her interview on Entrepreneur on Fire. So we're going to be in good company, because she's been on that before, and we will be shortly. And she gave a really great interview on that. So I'm interested to hear more about her story. And if you've not heard of her before, she's absolutely huge. Like, she's sold her agency now, but if you go to New York, look at any for sale board, it's all Corcoran. They absolutely own New York. So she's done really, really well. And her story, there's certainly going to be a lot to learn from, even if you don't aspire to that kind of scale.
Go and buy it. You'll enjoy it. And we'll also link to that interview as well, because that was a really good interview. That's how I found her as well. That's the resource of the week. Before we leave you, a couple of things to mention. Go and look at the website. It's improving all the time. We're tarting it up, giving it a good spruce. I'm ready for the summer. So have a look at it. It's really coming on. There's lots in there now, lots of resources, a lot of the resources of the week. So we mentioned it before. You can go back and find it all in one place. And also there's a button there for voicemails. We desperately want you to leave a recording so we can put a show together, don't we, Rob?
We've got some listener questions, some left over from our live episode and some voicemails we've had already. And we really want to do a listener question episode very soon. So please do, if you've got any kind of questions for us, head over there, hit that button and record it for us. If you screw it up, it's fine. You can do it again and we'll play that out on the show and answer everyone's questions in one of the coming weeks. Next week, though, we are talking about yields. Yields explained is what we're calling that, because the term gets bandied around all the time in property. You hear about gross yield, you hear about net yield, and you hear about things like return on investment, ROI, as well. So we're going to be explaining once and for all what all of those are, which ones we prefer, and when it's appropriate to be thinking about each of those. So that's going to be yields in next week's episode.
As Rick is leaving us, I think it's only right, Rob, that we let him exit the show in a bit of style. You know, he's given us a good run. He's got us to episode 19. 20 onwards, we're going to do something different. But he was there at the beginning. We can't knock him from that. So let's give him the outro.
And now, the end is near. And so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear. I'll state my case, of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway. And more, much more than this, I did it my way.